Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking on a genuinely fascinating challenge. We are going to decode the incredibly rich, multi-layered interpretations that the early church fathers used to try and understand one of the most, enigmatic texts in human history, Revelation chapter 11, verses 3 through 10. We're going to look closely at how these ancient scholars interpreted this ultimate battle between good and evil. And what you'll see is that they didn't just read it as a prediction of the end of the world, but as a deeply profound commentary on the human condition itself. Okay, let's dive right into this. To make sense of this heavily symbolic, 1,500-year-old theological debate, we're going to follow a structured 5-part journey. 1. The mystery of the witnesses. 2. Symbols of spiritual power. 3. The rise of the beast. 4. The city of ruins. And finally, 5. The world rejoices. Section 1. The mystery of the witnesses. Who will announce the end? So, before the ultimate end actually arrives, the text describes 2 forerunners who appear to announce it. But, as you might expect, the text is famously cryptic about exactly who these guys are. So the fundamental question that sparked literally centuries of debate among early commentators is quite simply, who are the 2 witnesses? When you dig into the source materials, scholars like Tychonius and Ecumenius wrestled deeply with this. I mean, are we looking for actual, literal people to return from the past, or is this whole thing a grand metaphor? Early church thinking basically split into 2 main camps here. On one side, you had thinkers like Victorianus and Pseudo-Hippolytus, who totally expected literal historical figures. You know, because guys like Enoch and Elijah never experienced a natural death in the biblical accounts, they were seen as prime candidates to come back. Victorians even threw Jeremiah into the mix. But then, on the other side, scholars championed a much more spiritual allegory. They argued that these 2 witnesses actually represent the 2 testaments, the Old and the New, or even the universal church itself, formed by both Jews and Gentiles, constantly testifying to the world. Now, regardless of whether they viewed them as literal men or a metaphor for the church, the early scholars universally agreed on the meaning of their wardrobe. The text specifically says the witnesses are clothed in sackcloth. But, and this is key, this wasn't interpreted as some ancient mandate on physical fashion. Instead, the sackcloth was a coded metaphor. It represents a spiritual stance of deep humility, of ongoing confession, and really a profound lamentation over the disobedience of the world. It's essentially the visual uniform for a public witness calling for repentance. Moving on to Section 2. Symbols of spiritual power. The arsenal of the prophets. These witnesses, they aren't just standing on a corner preaching. They're equipped with a truly terrifying arsenal of abilities. The text grants them immense physical powers. We're talking consuming fire pouring from their mouths, the ability to shut the sky to stop the rain, turning water into blood, and striking the earth with every conceivable plague. If you take this completely literally, it reads like a catastrophic high-budget action movie. But early theologians saw something much more sophisticated at play here. Now, what's really interesting is how brilliantly these literal plagues are translated into spiritual realities. Thinkers like Tychonius interpreted the consuming fire not as literal flames, but as the power of the church's prayers bringing either spiritual correction or a reciprocal just judgment. Shutting the sky? Well, that wasn't about weather control. It was a metaphor for the church's authority to withhold the divine rain of blessing from an unrepentant earth. And turning water to blood symbolized what happens when people carnalize or corrupt the spiritual, life-giving gifts of the church. They basically turn something vital and alive into something dead. This whole spiritual lens is perfectly captured in the metaphor of the 2 olive trees and 2 lampstands. Primatius actually unpacks this beautifully. He viewed the lampstands as representing the one unified church. And think about it. What keeps a lampstand burning brightly? Oil, right? So the 2 olive trees are the 2 testaments, constantly pouring the oil of scriptural knowledge into the church, fortifying it to stand as a beacon of light in a really dark world. Section 3. The rise of the beast. The antagonist emerges. Of course, a light that bright is absolutely bound to attract opposition. The narrative takes a pretty dark turn as the ultimate antagonist, the Antichrist, emerges to wage war against the witnesses. The text states that this beast ascends from the bottomless pit, or the abyss. But early theologians applied some profound psychological insight here. They didn't see the abyss as a physical cavern located somewhere deep under the Earth's crust. Instead, they decoded the abyss as the unstable, bitter substance of sinful human nature itself. It's this chaotic state constantly buffeted about by evil spirits. Just listen to the poetic gravitas of Oecumenius on this point. He writes, "He calls the life of people a bottomless pit, for it is bitter and distasteful on account of sins." This is a massive takeaway for us. The ultimate enemy doesn't just invade from some spooky external void. The antagonist is actually born from within our very own corrupted human nature. Once again, we see a fascinating contrast in how the early fathers viewed the origin of this beast. Victorinus, for instance, took a very historical, political interpretation. He argued the Antichrist would arise as a literal kingdom among the Caesars. But the wider spiritual consensus, championed by scholars like Tychonius and Bede, argued that this antagonist arises directly from the iniquitous hearts and the sheer deceit of humanity. It's an antagonist rooted entirely in pure spiritual deception. Which brings us to Section 4, the City of Ruins, the spiritual battlefield. Let's talk about the setting for this ultimate confrontation. According to the text, the beast overcomes the witnesses and leaves them right in the street of the great city. Andrew of Caesarea highlights a terrifyingly deceptive strategy here. He argues the Antichrist establishes his kingdom in physical Jerusalem specifically to mimic divine prophecy. It's the ultimate bait and switch. By imitating King David, the beast tricks the masses into accepting his earthly kingdom, masquerading as the true Christ. But the text then does something interesting. It renames this holy city, calling it spiritually Sodom and Egypt. Why would it do that? Well, Bede tells us this isn't about GPS coordinates. To be called Sodom and Egypt is to be deemed a city that is silent and dark. It's a powerful metaphor for a place entirely lacking the light of faith and completely devoid of the sound of confession. The early church laid out exactly why Jerusalem receives this devastating relabeling. First, it's called Egypt because historically and spiritually, it enslaved and abused Christ's servants. It's called Sodom for its licentiousness. It is tragically identified as the very place where the Lord was crucified. And, probably most chillingly, it becomes a site of ultimate moral darkness because it actually rejoices over the death of the righteous prophets. And that leads us right into our final section, Part 5, The World Rejoices, the Paradox of Celebration. Let's see how this all builds chronologically. This is the bizarre psychological twist of the prophecy, the wicked throwing a literal celebration over a tragic death. Mapping out the chilling final events described by scholars like Pseudo-Hippolytus, we start with the 1260 days of the witnesses' preaching. Then, the end times triggered the beast descending from the abyss. This leads directly to the final persecution and the death of the prophets. In a final, brutal act of disrespect, their bodies are left unburied in the street. And the immediate aftermath? The world doesn't mourn. No, the world rejoices. Which forces us to ask a really unsettling question. Why does the earth rejoice and even exchange gifts over the brutal deaths of holy prophets? This detail highlights the profound, gaping psychological contrast between the righteous and the unrighteous that the early church fathers desperately wanted us to understand. Tychonius actually makes a brilliant observation here. He explains that merely the sight of the righteous is a heavy, tormenting burden to an unrepentant world. The prophets didn't physically torture anyone, but their mere existence, their spiritual reproval, and their unwavering truth were felt as a painful torment. So when the witnesses are killed, the sinners are simply thrilled to escape that mere being held up to their behavior. But look, the early church didn't view these terrifying prophecies as just pure doom and gloom. Andrew of Caesarea really sums up the overarching theological takeaway. He wrote, "When we are judged, we are chastened so that we may not be condemned along with the world, but may rather escape an eternal punishment." This brings our entire narrative arc to a pretty powerful conclusion. The plagues, the sackcloth, the intense witness, all of it was viewed by the early church as a merciful call for divine correction. It was an opportunity to turn back before it was too late. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on today. When we decode these texts, are these apocalyptic visions merely predicting some distant sci-fi future? Or, as the early church fathers so masterfully argued, are they actually holding up a mirror to the ongoing everyday spiritual battles being waged right now within our own human nature? Honestly, it changes how you read the text entirely, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.